Hello and welcome to Medieval Beginnings. I'm Irina Dumitrescu, a contributor to the LRB, and I'm joined today, as always, by Mary Wellesley, who also writes for the paper. Hello, Mary.
Hello, Irina.
In the last episode, we were talking about sex, death, and magical weasels in the Lays of Marie de France. Today, we have a text no less beautiful, complex, or wacky. It is the Old French poem Roman de Silence. Dated to the second half of the 13th century, this is a tale about gender, power, and transformation. And it also contains a dragon, a lactose-intolerant wizard, and one of the earliest descriptions of fake tan in European literature. So, Mary, maybe we could just begin with a quick summary. What is this story about?
Okay, well, in its absolute simplest terms, we are in England. England is ruled by the king, King Ebene, and he has decreed that women cannot inherit property. And we have a couple who are called Cador and Euphemie, and they have a daughter. And when she's born, they name her Silence, and they decide that because she cannot inherit their property, they are the rulers of Cornwall. Because she cannot inherit property, they're going to raise her as a boy and she's going to live as a man. And that is the story. It's incredibly complicated and a lot of stuff happens, but that is the very basic contours.
And there's a lot going on with the names. I mean, we can already hear it even in this brief overview that it's very much a poem about language as well, isn't it?
Yes, so King Ebene's wife is called Euphème, which literally means, I suppose, kind of a lass femme, a lass woman. And the mother of Silence is called Euphemie, which is literally, I suppose, euphemism. And there is a discussion amongst Cador and Euphemie, who are the parents of Silence, about what she should be called. And they say she could either be called Silentius, you know, this kind of Latin name for silence, but she could be called Silentia if she decides to live as a woman. But she's called Silence throughout the poem. And I think what's kind of interesting is that clearly the poet is interested in how names and more generally how language can be unstable and about how you can misread and mishear. Even we get confused when we're talking about these characters because the name of, as it were, the good queen and the bad queen is extremely similar. And you're meant to kind of mix these things up all the time. And I think this is part of a general strategy within the poem to highlight how unstable language is and how names as these kinds of signifiers might actually signify something different from what you think they're signifying, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I mean, we have instability of bodies and instability of language, and we're going to
instability of power
and of genre. And
yes,
these are some of the things we'll look at in this episode. Maybe first we could take a step back and just places. What do we know about the poem? You know, where and when it was written. What's the manuscript context for it?
So this text is written in Old French, and it dates from probably the second half of the 13th century. And it survives in one single manuscript, which is in England. And it's part of the University of Nottingham's special collections. And it was originally in a place called Woollerton Hall in Nottingham, where this single manuscript was discovered in the 20th century inside a box labelled old papers, no value. And so it's a poem that has generated a huge amount of scholarly interest since its discovery in the 20th century. But before that point, it was basically unknown to scholarship. The interesting thing about the manuscript is that it made its way to England in the 15th century. Most likely, it appears that it was loot. So during the 100 Years' War, there was a siege in 1428 in a place called Laval. And it appears that this manuscript was stolen by English forces, possibly the Earl of Shrewsbury. And the manuscript contains this inscription saying that it belonged to Madame de Laval. So interesting because that's pointing to a female owner, which is lovely because it's just a reminder that women were the consumers and often the producers of literature throughout this period. But also it highlights something that I think is rather fascinating, that the value of this text, imagine these soldiers charging through the Château de Lonval, this castle, and looking for stuff that they could take with them, stuff of value. And of course, a manuscript with lots of wonderful French texts in it.
And pictures.
Yeah. So Silence itself has 14 miniatures within it, and there are miniatures throughout the manuscript. But this wonderful reminder of how much these kinds of texts were valued. But also, this is a period in which English, particularly aristocrats, definitely speak French, enjoy French literature. French literature is incredibly popular. Just because this is a work in French doesn't mean it was unintelligible to English soldiers. And so it's sort of nice to be thinking about this text in amongst a whole load of Anglo-Norman and Middle English, because although it's written in French, it's very much part of this sophisticated cross-channel milieu. And we see a lot of the themes of this text are ones that we also see in Anglo-Norman works and also in Middle English works, testifying to this rich shared cultural heritage between the two, what we now think of as two nations, but at the time were more unified.
Well, and it's quite appropriate since Silence, at least begins and ends as a woman, and the story begins and ends with war. And Silence spends her time going back and forth between England and France. So there's a way in which, there are other romances and texts in the manuscript. This isn't the only one, but there's a way in which the poem already reflects those cross-channel relationships. But maybe it's worth talking a little bit about the genre of romance, not just because it's so popular in the Middle Ages, but I think really Silence, and whoever the author of Silence was, play a lot on the genre of romance, and quite consciously and in somehow slightly over-the-top ways.
Yes. So we should say, what is a romance? Well, a romance, in simple terms, it's a long narrative poem, but that perhaps obscures how much fun the romance genre is. I think it's perhaps easiest to think of romance as the ancestor of the fairy tale. These are kind of fairy stories. There are often adventures and noble characters and marvelous events, and we see a lot of those in this text. It feels like the author is kind of cherry picking from all of the romances that he, or indeed she, knows, and it's just kind of mixing them all together into this amazing kind of confected 7,000-line masterpiece.
Fairy tales or modern action-adventure stories or Star Wars, we have so many different kinds of genre that are descended from romance. And, one thing that even modern readers will recognize from, for contemporary media is that you tend to see a lot of very similar plot elements. Romance is always new and also highly formulaic at the same time. You see, the same kind of character over and over. The hero who goes on an adventure, some kind of seductive or dangerous woman, perhaps, or a beloved, pure woman who is to be won as a bride, or magical helpers, old men or things like that. We have all of those in this poem, of course, as well. Coincidences, impressive coincidences, right? All of these things which we find in modern adventure stories as well. They're very typical of romance. But the difference is romance is very often about family. So very many of the popular romances in the later Middle Ages have to do with families being broken up and brought back together, and a social order that is destroyed when the family is torn apart and reinstated at the end of the story. So I think that's also something we can say, that in very many romances, not all, family is very important.
Yes, although whether this tale concludes with a happy ending is very much to be seen.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Medieval Beginnings, a close reading series from the London Review of Books. To listen to the full episodes and all our other close reading series, sign up to our close reading subscription. Go to lrb.me/close readings or click on the link in the description.